Yay, great. Well, do you guys want to just jump into my interview question?
I think that's the plan, and I've got a recorder going, and you have a recorder. You're gonna get a transcript of this.
Yeah, yeah, I'll send you the transcript too. Great. Well, okay, so when I called Russ like however long ago it was, you said that it was unlikely I had any. You said that I probably didn't know what my conscious experience was like, and I said I thought my conscious experience was probably mostly nothing plus some music.
Plus some, plus some what?
Music.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, I wasn't 100% right, but I wasn't too far off.
No, you were pretty close. In my own defense, I probably said, I probably didn't say, Sadie, you don't know what your inner experience is. What I said was probably something like, a lot of people think they know what their inner experience is and are wrong, and you probably don't have much reason to be confident one way or the other about which category you're in.
Okay. How many people do art right roughly versus wrong?
Well, I think that's a slippery slope, and it depends on how you define right or wrong. But I would say most people are somewhat surprised, and some people are dramatically surprised. And wherever you put the slider in between surprised and dramatically surprised, you can have whatever percentage you would like about people who would be surprised.
So what?
So for example, in what you just said, you didn't say, I have quite a bit of sensory awareness, what we call sensory awareness.
Yeah.
Which it turns out you did have quite a bit of sensory awareness.
And I think of that as thinking because it seems more like just deceiving.
Well, that's also part of why people are surprised. How you categorize what inner experience is, I guess, could differ from one person to the next.
So but do you guys do like a breakdown or like sort of summary of like the different categories I experience fall into?
Yes. So, and we're engaged in that process right now. So what we have done is we met with you and went through each of the samples, and tried to grasp what was going on and wrote a few words about those, which we call a caption or a green caption or something. And you were there for that, so you know how that happened. And then Alek has made a spreadsheet that has, well, I guess first off, before that, Alek and I each independently wrote a characterization of what we thought we just saw. So on that same day, Alek wrote and I wrote a few words about what Sadie's experience was like, and it said there was a lot of nothing, and there was sort of a range of nothing from absolutely nothing to just sort of partially nothing, and there was sensory awareness, and there was singing in your head or whatever. I don't remember exactly what Alek wrote or exactly what I wrote, but at any rate, we wrote those things, and it seemed like we pretty much agreed. So then Alek prepared a spreadsheet which had those categories on it. And now we're in the process of independently going back through the samples to try to indicate which of these categories apply to which samples. And we do that independently as a way of keeping ourselves honest. Basically, it's a sort of a complicated thing that we're trying to come across. So I don't remember how many samples that you have, 47 samples or 39 samples or however many it is. We're trying to keep those awake. And when we do it, I might forget a detail, or Alek might forget a detail, and it could be that when we go back through all of these things, we would find the categories that we have defined need to be refined, and that's part of the process that we're into right now. And Alek, I'm almost done with my portion of this. Probably later on today I will finish that off and send it to you. And then the next step is going to be, then Alek and I will go through and look at every individual place where we were discrepant into how we transferred this written description into numbers like ones and zeros.
Uh-huh.
And then we will talk about, well, why did you say that, Alec? And she will say, well, I did it for this reason, and maybe she can convince me, and or maybe we'll have to refine a category, or maybe it'll be I overlooked something, or maybe she overlooked something, or whatever. But the object is to be uh, honest with ourselves about how we count things. Not so much that counting is the important thing, because a big part of this deal is maybe we should refine. So we have sketched a categorization of Sadie's inner experience, and maybe that's good, and maybe we did maybe, or maybe when we actually try to apply those categories sample by sample by sample by sample independently, that then we will realize that, well, Alec thought we were talking about this, and I thought we were talking about that, and we used the same words in the first place, but when we go back and apply them to the individual samples, they get the discrepancies manifest themselves, and then we'll try to figure that out.
So does everyone have their own set of categories?
Yes, everybody has their own set of categories.
Oh, wow. So there's like no way that you can sort of combine all the data that you collected over the years. Like everyone has their own sort of geographic study.
Well, yes and no, I would say. Mostly yes, somewhat no. We have said over the years that there are 5 categories that occur pretty frequently, and so we will rate every sample for everybody according to those 5 categories. But for you, only one of those categories actually even counts. The other, I think we're going to find that 4 out of the 5 are zeros, always, and 1, which is sensory awareness, is going to happen fairly frequently. And so we can say, well, according to sensory awareness, Sadie had quite a lot of it, and according to all the other, the big, what we call the 5 frequent phenomena, 5FP, Sadie, it doesn't matter about 4 of those, and one of them she's got sometimes pretty garden variety sensory awareness. But so an answer to your question is, I don't think that the 5FP are particularly interesting. It's not like we have created 5 new categories and now everybody ought to be rated on these five categories. We do that because they're fairly frequent categories. That's why we call them the 5 frequent phenomena. But Sadie is much more interesting in her idiographic, what we call idiographic, which means Sadie's particularization. So in Sadie's case, I would say the more interesting part is what we're trying to make sense of, the degree to which thinking is present. Sometimes she thinks she's thinking and there's nothing present, and sometimes she thinks she's thinking and there is thinking present. And we don't have to worry about that for other people, because most other people say, well, I was thinking about this, and they can tell you exactly what it was like. So the answer to your question is that everybody is on his own track, and the answer is, until there's good reason to do it otherwise, yes, I think that's correct.
Are there any sort of larger questions that your Sadie research helps answer?
Well, I think the largest question, I think our research is aimed at the foundation of the largest question. What is consciousness? Well, it seems to me you ought to know what's going on in inner experience before you can try to figure out what is going on in consciousness. I don't have a theory. I don't think Alec has a theory about what consciousness is, but I think we would probably both of us agree that you need to understand what inner experience. What you need to do as good a job as we can do about understanding what Sadie's inner experience was like at this moment and at that moment and at that moment, and what a whole lot of other people's inner experience was like at a whole lot of other moments, before you can start to make some kind of generalization about
the
consciousness.
question I think drew you to us was the inner monologue, inner speech debate. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely.
So, I think that's another question that we can lend some wisdom to, right? Is well, the question is, does everybody have constant internal monologue? We've now, just as part of that, sampled with 3 different people, none of whom had constant internal monologue, so we can know and hear, but here are 3 very specific and very different results of that interest. Sadie's sampling and Sadie's characteristic inner experience was nothing like Lena's, but both of them came to us out of interest in that question. And Lena at least thought she had constant internal speech. I can't remember if you had a take on that, but so those kind of questions in a sort of sideways way answered by studies like ours with you, I think.
So it seems one generalization you can take from all this research is that people have very different inner experiences, and most people are not consistently any one thing. Is that accurate?
Yes.
What else have you learned? Anything else?
Oh, yeah.
That's a hard question to answer. So you could ask, well, what have you learned about Sadie? What have we learned about Sadie?
Okay.
And even the answer to that is sort of a hard thing to know, because I think at one level we could say, I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to get at what Sadie's inner experience is really like. And have we done a perfect job? Absolutely not. We've only looked at 37 microseconds of her samples or of her experience, or however many there are. And it could be that if we had done this in 2019, it would have been different, or it could have been, it would have been the same. We don't really know the answer to that. We try to be honest about that. So we have not gotten to the essential Sadie, the essence of Sadie. We have gotten to Sadie as we have gotten to Sadie, and more than that we can't really say. But Sadie came to us with an interest in, or a self-characterization of face blind, as I recall the story.
Yeah.
And
it's not just self-characterization. I failed a lot of tests and got my brain scanned a lot.
well, it could be that we ought to get together and look at those results, or we ought to get the scientists together to look at those results, because now we have a view of Sadie in 2 very different ways. And that would be another thing that I would say that we have learned about this whole process, and that is that our way of looking is very different from what organized psychology is looking. Mm. So Sadie comes and says, I got this face blindness stuff, and I can document it at Harvard and wherever else I've documented it. And I would say, after having watched what's going on, is that Sadie's inner experience is probably not primarily characterized by face blindness. That is, I would guess, this is just a speculation, having seen 37 things, is that face blindness is one aspect of the way Sadie's inner experience is, and it's probably not the most important aspect. And it's sort of, I've been thinking about it in this face blindness thing, how to sort of characterize that. And the best metaphor that I've come up with is that in my garage, I have a rubber abrading system.
Why?
Well, because you have one in your garage too, and so does Alek. Most people call them automobiles, but I prefer to call them rubber abrading systems, because that they in fact do abrade rubber. I start out with lots of rubber, and after a little while I've got less rubber. So you could say this is a rubber abrading system. But in the process of doing that, you say, well, that's not the main thing that this system does. It's a transportation system, and yes it is. So I'm guessing that face blindness is sort of like that. That face blindness is one probably more or less insignificant piece of what Sadie's inner experience is really like. And it's accurate to say she's face blindness, just like it's accurate to say I drive a Honda Accord rubber abrader. But that is not necessarily the best way to understand Honda Accords or Sadie Dingfelders.
Uh, um, I like Alec. I think is it accurate to say you're going to be a clinical psychologist, or you already are one?
I will be in like 3 months, I guess, 4 months, something like that.
Awesome. Congratulations. I was just wondering, like, are you going to be able to take what you've learned from doing DES to your practice, and it doesn't have to be like immediately, but in the long run, or just guessing.
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, it's a hard thing to do outside the lab of Russ Rover, but it's not an impossible thing to do. Thanks to Kate and so forth. I don't know. I think it infuses just about everything I do and think about psychology. And in your earlier question about, well, what else have you learned from? I think there's a sort of meta lesson to take from DES2, which is it does make you rethink the whole psychology machine, which I think Dr. Robert was just kind of alluding to, right? If you, once you've done this, once you've spent the time to get to know a Sadie in the way we have, it makes you skeptical of the other ways that we figure out people or label or categorize or come to conclusions, and not to devalue those things or whatever. I think everything has its place, but it does make you rethink, neuroimaging studies and just all of these things that just seem too quick, too easy, too neglectful of like fundamental elements of people. Which took us 8 days and 37 tries to just start to talk about, Sadie's spectrum of nothing, and even then we haven't figured it out. So it always makes me thoughtful about those things, and maybe someday I'll do something about that. But as for doing more DES, I sure hope so. I don't think I would ever want to be done. I don't know.
I was wondering, like, my next project for my book is to try to learn how to visualize. Do you think that it's worth trying to, like, learn a new way of thinking?
I think that and would be interesting with you after.
So you broke up for most of that.
Oh, okay. Am I normal again?
Yeah, I think it might come from Sadie. I think if Sadie makes any noises at all, then she kills your audio. I'm not sure about that, but that's the way it seems to me.
Oh, she muted. Oh, well, I just said I think that's a very interesting question, and would want to sample with you after you have learned to visualize if you think you have or have not. But we had no examples of visualization in your sampling. Also had no examples of feelings, emotional experience, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. If you can, or I don't know.
So you're still.
Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, I learned that I'm really out of touch with my emotions. Do most people have more experience with this, emotions?
The big individual differences there. There are some people who at just about every beep are saying, well, I'm feeling this, and then they'll tell you about this, that this is anxiety or whatever, and I can feel the anxiety here and whatever. But there are huge individual differences there, and they're not well understood by the people who have them and by the science. So for some people, one person will say, for example, I feel heavy-hearted, and they mean that entirely metaphorically. That what they mean is they understood what this phrase heavy-hearted means, and they take it to mean sad over the long haul or something like that. And other people, when they say heavy-hearted, they mean my heart feels like it's weighted down inside my body, and the people who speak like that to each other have no idea that one guy means I feel this weight in my chest, and the other guy is speaking entirely metaphorically. And the science doesn't know that either, because the science is asking questionnaire questions, which check off something about how sad you feel, and they're inferring something about heavy-heartedness or whatever. But they're not nearly careful enough to understand that people the individual differences with people. And I guess I would say that is, you ask what I've learned from doing DES for 40 years. Well, that's one thing that if you really care about what people's inner experience is like, you have got to be very careful because people are just dead wrong about what they say about their inner experience, and if they're right, they don't know what aspect of what they say is right. And so if you're interested in the way people are, which I think is sort of a fundamentally human thing, to be interested in what people are like, you've got to mind your P's and Q's. And I want to go back to your previous question, which Alec answered, but I didn't get a chance to answer, which was about, well, could you learn to do visualization? And I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. And I have no idea if somebody wanted to give me $1 million to teach them how to innerly visualize, I don't know what I would do about that. And I probably know as much about how inner visualization actually is experienced as anybody in the Western planet, but I still don't know how to train somebody to do that. I know in myself when I have more visualization and when I have less visualization, and so I could say, well, if you're like me, then this is what it is that you should do. But I'm not sure that there's any rational reason why I should generalize from me to you in that regard.
So wait, what circumstances do you have more visualization in?
Well, I know, for example, that if I am weeding in my garden and I'm trying to pull out a particular kind of weed, or if I'm pruning and I'm trying to prune off a particular kind of bud or whatever, and I do that for an hour or something like that, then when I'm done, I have quite a few visualizations of that my visual system has apparently processed how to see these kinds of weeds by comparison to those kinds of flowers or whatever. And when I'm done with that, I got a lot of visualization. And I think my own visualization is more frequent when I'm laying down than when I'm sitting up. But I'm not sure that either one of those is generalizable to the world. And I'm pretty sure that nobody in the Western planet knows the answer to that better than I do. Which I'm not trying to be, self-aggrandizing or whatever about that, but I know what it would take to answer that question. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that there are people out there who have done what I think it takes to answer that question.
It's the same thing I saw in terms of sort of people interpreting your research. And like on Twitter and Facebook and things like that, is that your study where you found, the 5 categories and you had percentages, those were percentages of experiences, but most people decided that they were actually percentages of people. Mm-hmm. People seem to want to be grouped into categories, which is kind of interesting because that's almost the opposite of what you're doing. So anyway, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of this sort of neurotribalism that has been sort of imposed on your work.
Well, I have been thinking actually quite a lot about that, and it might very well be that that's the genesis of my next book. What's bubbling up in me in terms of a book is actually something like the answer to that question. Because I think DES, more than maybe most or maybe even all of other psychology, tries not to do that. I would say across my career, people who have been working with me, we are not categorization people. That's our interest is fundamentally not categorical. And maybe that was what Alec was alluding to earlier on when she said she has a different view of what psychology is about. But psychology is categorical. Either it's universalist, in which case it wants to say, well, everybody is like this, or it's categorical, in which it wants to say, well, women are like this and men are like that, or black people are like this and white people are like that, or whatever. And I think there is precious little evidence to believe that that is wise scientific strategy. It is dead center in the target of scientific strategy. And it may very well be that that is not, that urge is destructive. And I would say that it isn't like 40 years ago I said, well, let me try not to be categorical. I don't think that's how this came about. It came about, you know, I started out as categorical as everybody else, I think, probably, but it came from, let me try to be faithful to the phenomena. And when you do that for 40 years, you end up not being impressed by categories.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of naturally falls away because every time you believe in a category, which, you know, I've believed in my share of categories across my lifetime, it fucks you up every step of the way. I think because whatever category I would have applied to Sadie doesn't really apply to Sadie. I could have come at Sadie with, does she have inner speech or not? And I wouldn't have heard a word that Sadie had to say. And I could have come at Sadie by, well, Sadie face blind or not? And I wouldn't have heard a word that Sadie had to say about her inner experience. And even if I had come to Sadie with, well, Sadie's got a lot of nothing in her experience, that would have screwed things up in terms of actually confronting the phenomena that Sadie presents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, which is not to say, and now I think I'm saying what Alex said a little bit ago too, which is not to say that categorization might not be a useful thing. I'm thinking categorization might be useful. So if we had sampled with several thousand people who are face blind in the same way that we sampled with Sadie, at the end of that, we might be able to say something about face blindness as a real thing, as a real phenomenon. But we are so far away from that now I'm pretty sure, rightly or wrongly, I could be totally screwed about this, but people who try to say something about face blindness when they don't really know anything at all about the phenomenon of face blindness are likely to screw things up. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter whether they put you in a scanner or run you through the state-of-the-art highfalutin university approved programs. They still don't know anything about the phenomenon of Sadie's experience. Even though face blindness has got to be thought of as a experiential category. When you say I'm face blind, you're saying something about your everyday experience. You're saying I see people and I don't recognize them as people, or something like that. I don't recognize who they are. But if so, here again is what I've learned, I guess. So it is, if you want to say something about everyday experience, you better know something about your everyday experience.
So the way you would study baseline would be to capture people's experiences when they look at faces, for instance?
I wouldn't. That's the whole deal. What I would do is I would do exactly what we did with you. Somebody came with we have selected people, chosen people, encouraged people who have some kind of a characteristic. The biggest group we have is of bulimic women with bulimia nervosa. And I think we've got something to say about bulimia nervosa. We haven't been able to say it to anybody, but I think we have something to say about that. And it comes from what I call fishing in the bulimia pond, which is to say, if we want to know something about the inner experience in bulimia, we should do the same kind of sampling as we did with Sadie in people who are bulimic. And if we do that with enough people, after a while, we're going to learn something about the kind of fish that swim in a pond that has a bulimia sign outside of it. And if we did that with face blind people, we had enough of face blind people, people who are certified face blind by some external expert about whatever that means, then at the end of the day, we might have something interesting to say about face blind people. And it might very well be, probably would be, that face blindness is really a subset of some other much bigger kind of a deal.
Can you expand on that?
Well, it could be that nothingness is more important than face blindness. That there's something about nothingness, and we really don't even know much about nothing. We got 37 samples, and 16 of them. I'm just making up numbers here, but 16 of them have nothing in them, and they all come from the same person. And she's got her idiosyncratic way of describing things, and we've got our idiosyncratic way of hearing things. And so we know precious little about even that, even though we know way more than anybody else does. But it's still not much. And if we knew more about that, we might find that, people who have this nothing experience, whose thinking is sort of abstract even to them, that a subset of that is face blindness. They're face blind. And it's not that the face blindness makes them think it's the other way around. It's that the more fundamental thing is the blindness to my own thought process. And one aspect of that might be face blindness. And that's the not so colorful way of saying what I was saying about the rubber abrader in my garage. If you want to get from here to there in the real planet, the chances are good you're going to abrade rubber. But you're not doing that as the primary thing. And if you're the kind of person who has the kind of neurons, whatever that means, or the kind of experience, whatever that means, or the kind of childhood upbringing or trauma or whatever it is that you have that I don't know nothing about, or the kind of atmosphere that you've lived in, or the lead that you've imbibed, or whatever that has made you the way you are, which I don't know anything about any of that, that may be one of the, so there's genetics and environment and whatever. It could be that leads both to thought blindness and face blindness. I'm not claiming that to be true because I've only got a sample of one. What I'm saying is that we need to have more of the basic data before we make some kind of a pretty high level judgment about something as arcane as face blindness. Why would you pick face blindness as the most interesting thing to characterize Sadie with? And you know what the answer to that is? The answer is it makes a great story. And I would say another thing that I've learned over the years is that the better the story, the less likely it is to be really true. And that's of course a bit of an exaggeration in the over the top way that I generally am, but it is a reasonable thing when somebody tells you a really good story to be skeptical of something in that story.
Yeah.
I have maybe a gentler view of face blindness. I've had a couple of patients who I ultimately diagnosed with face blindness and was very skeptical. And that's a hard thing to agree to, but I think there's something quite distinct about that presentation, as you well know. But I would also say, I often find there's a kernel of truth in our hasty kind of psychological theories that I think we understand better in DES. So as an example, we're talking about the women with bulimia. And the broader, psychology literature would tell you, well, these women are really emotionally dysregulated. That's a big phrase, right? There's a busyness to their emotionality. They are overwhelmed. They feel very overwhelmed before they purge or before they binge, for example. And based on our sampling, there is some truth to that. These participants had almost always really busy, chaotic experience, 20 separate threads of things going on at once. I mean, way beyond what we saw with you, for example. And some of them would say that relieved, so to speak, after they would purge. We don't have, beeps timing that out, but they would say that. And I think will draw a relationship there, I think, between face blindness and like emotional experience. Right? There's thought to be something funky about your emotional sense of people or something like that, or is that right?
Actually, on tests of like sort of perceiving emotion, most face-blindness people are normal, are pretty normal. We're also just as good as regular folks at like guessing gender and age. It really just seems to be like facial recognition.
Well, I thought there was a thing about like emotional, whatever, feelings for people, but it is interesting to me that like you didn't have any feelings and would be, I mean, you have feelings, but and for sampling it would be interesting to see if a group of 1,000 folks with face blindness have something about feeling or something if they share that.
And it seems like that kind of research would never happen because it takes forever. So I was just wondering, like, just have more practical ideas for doing this kind of bottom-up research, or if that's that and that's how we have to do it.
So I think you're mistaken about that. I think, first off, I don't think we really need 1,000. I've said 1,000, and you probably need 1,000, but I think we've got something pretty strong to say about the bulimic women, and I think we're in the low 20s or high. Alek probably knows more what that number is.
Yeah.
How many?
24.
Yeah. And so it doesn't take huge numbers, but each one of those 24, we spent the same amount of time as we did with you, or approximately. So there's an investment, but that investment is not that great when you really stop to think about it. So we spent 8 or 10 hours with you, and another 8 or 10 hours between Alek and me, trying to figure out what was going on and how long you wore the beeper, if you want to count that. So we're into 100 hours, let's say, invested in Sadie. And if we wanted to do 25 Sadies, that's 2,500 hours, which is what a working year or something like that. It's not insurmountable. And for the price of one fMRI scanner, you could hire a lot of people and train them in how to do it if you thought you needed to do it. So your question is, I think, maybe the same question as before, because so what the two questions that I'm trying to put together here are some kind of a belief in categorization and that science can't possibly operate without categorization. And I don't think either one of those is true. I think it's a matter of investment. I guess you could call it infrastructure. It's probably not. I'd take that back. It's probably not infrastructure, but you need a mindset that says we can, with fidelity, explore people to the extent that we can explore them, and then admit that into science as a useful thing. That I would say is another what I've learned. I think we have established, Alek and I and other people in my lab have established that it's possible to say something useful about people's inner experience. And science ought to be doing it.
Yeah, I think it is largely a matter of what science values right now. And I mean, I think there's some interesting stuff that came out this year on like how much the National Institutes of Health has spent on imaging studies over the last decade or something like that. And I mean, these were critiques, but the folks are saying, really, people learn nothing new about mental or treatment from these studies. We don't have better medications for serious mental illness. We have not found the brain regions that cause schizophrenia. Like, we haven't done what we said we would do in 10 years and millions or billions of dollars. And that's just a map, I think, what we value in psychology and in science, and a fraction of that could go towards slower psychology, more basic psychology like this.
Well, think of what we could do with 1% of the imaging study.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, that's in the multi-millions of dollars.
Yeah. And it's a categorical thing. I think I don't know, Dr. Hilbert's had a longer view of the field, but it seems to me we're in this heavy, heavy categorical time, which I think speaks to what you were saying about, I like that term, you said neurotribalism, I think. I've read the book Neurotribes, so I suppose that came out of a similar group or whatever, but there is like such a strong, look at our political landscape and the division, and just, it is just part of the zeitgeist. It is just in the water right now. And I think there has to be a shift. And it's unfortunate that might be in 100 years or whatever, and maybe I won't be doing DES anymore and I'll miss it. But humanism, or like humanistic psychology did that at one point, pushed back against psychiatry and said, let's actually listen to people. And we lost that already. It's hardly been 60, 70 years, and we've lost that again. And we're in the categorical, in the clinical world anyway. You get a diagnosis, your diagnosis determines exactly what evidence-based treatment will work for you. And of course, it doesn't for a great chunk of people. And many, many, many clinicians, many I work with, myself at times, are just totally blinded by the category, are just doing what I help them to do and missing everything important. And I think it's very similar to the research side of things. It all comes back to that love of categories and how destructive they can be.
So can you give me examples, or just an example, because I've been in this category of psychology my whole life, but can you think of an example from any science that sort of made great progress without categories, or a priori categories?
Well, I think that the advances in science are usually methodologically driven. So I think biology came of age when Van Leeuwenhoek or whoever that guy was, invented a microscope, and he had all kinds of categories, and the categories were wrong. His categories were wrong. He thought that his animalcules were that the cells that he was observing were total miniature versions of the adults, or whatever it is that he thought. I forget, but he was wrong about that. But what he was right about was that there were little things out there that you could look at if you if you ground your lenses in the right way. And so biology has come a long way since before the microscope was invented. And so I see DES as being sort of that way. I think probably most of what we say about what we have found is probably wrong, but that it is there to find, and that it is not a figment of Hurlburt's imagination or Alek's imagination, or Sadie's imagination, that there is some pretty real distinction between seeing a visual image and thinking a thought with no thought, having nothingness behind my thinking. That I think that's a palpable distinction, and it's not a mere verbal gloss on, well, everybody's experience is the same way. Sadie's exactly the same as I am. I got lots of visual images. Sadie's got no visual images, she says, but we're really the same. We're really the same. I just don't think that's true. I think that the psychology business has come to believe that in a defensive kind of maneuver, and it hides the fact that they have psychology in general has turned its back on careful observation.
Mm-hmm.
Like Alek has just come through a middle of the road PhD program, and you could ask her, well, how many hours did you have, how many class periods did you have that taught you how to do good observation? And I'm guessing that she would say 0. And I think that's true from, that's not a University of Nevada, Las Vegas thing. That's a worldwide psychology thing. We're not teaching people how to do good observation.
Okay. I think, not to be like too poetic or philosophical or something about it, but I think psychology's subject matter is people, human beings, and that is a different, very different endeavor than a lot of other sciences. But yet that it is not, which I find to be just the most bizarre and backwards and confused way to go at it. But when I think, as I sometimes think more about sciences like anthropology or archaeology, the finding of what is already there, the excavation, the just description, really, right? Like those sort of sciences appeal to me, and they make tremendous, discoveries of what is really there, which in this case, I think there is for most something really there, and we're just finding a way to find it and tell it and make it available. And I think that's part of what you have to do when your subject matter is human beings.
We have an advantage over the archaeologists in that the bones that we're looking for are present all around us, and we can have as many of them as we want. We don't have to spin a theory on the basis of 12 bones that we found scattered across 3 continents. We can have as many of Sadie's bones as she's willing to give us, and yet we don't do that. I mean, there are very few people on the Western planet who are carefully looking at inner experience in what I would call carefully looking at inner experience. And that is remarkable to me. But the zeitgeist is totally impersonal. I mean, the what is valued is big data, and big data is the impersonal piled on the impersonal, piled on the impersonal, and then applied in a statistical way back to some other impersonal group. And it's effective. You can make a lot of money that way, if you can figure out on the basis of how much time you spend Googling these sites, what kind of product you're likely to buy, and then you can distribute advertisements or whatever. And that I would say your average psychologist lusts after that. And that is, I don't know, sick.
Yeah. As many data points as they can get and as sophisticated of statistics as they can do. We worship the statistics in psychology. And really, people become data points. And we prefer that.
And data points on the way in and data points on the way out. So Alek a bit ago was talking about the therapy as being guided by evidence-based treatments or whatever, and that's true, and it's a sin or whatever. And I'm not holding myself up as the judge of what is a sin and what is not, but it is blinding of the increase in understanding as well. It's not only do we have to apply the categories that we already have as if they were good, which they're not, but as if they were good, we have to apply them. But we can't build new studies because the categories are driving the new studies as well.
You mentioned that sort of the psychology's turn towards its current state was a defensive maneuver, and I was wondering, what's it defending against?
The money It's economic, I think, primarily. It's to publish, which you need to do if you want to be an academic psychologist. If you want to publish, then you got to look like you are a statistician. And if you're going to look like you're a statistician, you got to not look like you're too interested in the individuals.
And can you say anything about what you found with your bulimic population, or are you like working on a paper or something?
If only you knew, Sadie, how many papers we have written.
Oh no.
We have. So Alek was not involved in actually the studies of the bulimia. Her predecessors were, but we have, Alek and I have together submitted an article about bulimia to every bulimia journal, every eating disorder journal, and can't get it published.
Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
And we've rewritten it. It's not like we sent the same journal article every time. We've worked at trying to get what we have to say about bulimia out there. And everybody says, well, doesn't line up with my theory, and therefore it can't be true. And so the defensive maneuver is, if you listen to what we have to say, you have got to think, well, maybe what I think about bulimia isn't right. And people don't do that easily.
Yeah.
And we're happy to say, we only know what we know about we only got from 24 people, and we've got lots of limitations here, but there is something to be. There might very well be a kernel of truth in here somewhere. That's, I would say, the spirit of the papers that we have been trying to write. But nobody wants to listen to that.
I think part of the defensiveness might be, or probably is, that if we let go of the categories, or if we, adopted a slower approach, we'd have to admit that we don't know as much as we claim to know. I think Dr. Robert and I know this intimately. People will ask, you are asking us now, what do you know? What have you learned? And a lot of times you have to say, well, not that much, but we're doing our best, and maybe in a couple hundred years, somebody will say something. And it's humbling and infuriating, but it is the honest truth, and the rest of psychology would have to do that, and I think it's too painful.
Yeah, I can see that. Gosh, I think that's like all my questions. Do you have any questions for me, or is there anything you wish I'd asked that I didn't?
Are there reflections you've had on what it was like to do DES that you haven't kind of told us about, or that you've been sitting on?
I feel like if we weren't currently in a pandemic, I would not have had the patience to do it. It would have driven me crazy. But since I don't have a lot else going on, and you were like my only social interaction, I'm so grateful that you'll talk to me an hour a week. But I think that even so, I did like the first or second time, well, even or towards the end of sessions, like I'm like, oh my God, they are splitting hairs. Like, who cares? But that's the process, So, and I wanted to learn about it, and I'm just like extraordinarily impressed and surprised by how hard you guys work to understand specifically what people are saying. So honestly, a lot of the time, I wasn't trying to be specific. And then when we, as you know. And the other thing that I was really struck by is the difficulty of communication. Because if everyone is so different in terms of communication style, or not communicate, just like different in terms of our mental world, it's kind of like shocking that we're able to communicate anything, at all to each other. Yeah, I feel like I had something else to say about that. Oh yeah, and like sort of that's why Twitter and Facebook is getting obsessed with these sorts of qualitative questions about people's experience, I think, is because it is natural to think that everyone else's experience is basically like yours, So when you hear someone say something like, I count sheep at night, I'm like, yeah, but that's just counting, right? You know, and I don't really listen to the person or even think to ask the question of like, what do you mean by that? Yeah, so yeah, those are my random thoughts.
So when you said a minute ago when you started out that it was like splitting hairs, these guys are really splitting hairs. Did you feel that on day 7 and 8 as well as on day 1 and 2?
I didn't feel. I felt like I still felt like you were splitting hairs, but that was the point, I guess. I, the difference, yeah.
So how can you say more about how that splitting hairs thing seemed to change across time?
Yeah, I think it was more just like I was on board with it.
At the end.
Like, yeah, at the end. But like, so I started out feeling pretty annoyed, and then I was like, okay, I trust these guys. They're smart. They're working really hard at this. Like, the least I can do is split hairs with them. And then by the end, I was like, okay, like we have actually come up with some meaningful subcategories of nothingness, and that never occurred to me to divide up. And I don't know if that's a useful thing to have done, but it does make me feel a little better about the fact that I don't know. It feels like, yeah. So did I answer?
Well, that's a very valuable thing to hear, I think, because I think that's the way it is. Because, and to a large degree, everything that we have said about categories and whatever today comes from your first day kind of experience. You know, like, well, why the hell would I want to split that kind of hair? And what's that about? And I have said probably to you or in public a lot of times that the hardest thing about DES is getting past the first day. You know, nobody wants to do the first day, and it's hard for the interviewers to do the first day, and so I think interviewers bail out, and it's hard for subjects to do the first day, and you got to have the faith that there's something on the other side of the first day, and most people don't have that faith. And it is hard because you got to come into an interview. Russ and Alek have to come to Sadie on the first day saying, I don't know anything at all here. And if I pretend like I know anything, then and Russ should say to Alek, if I pretend like I know anything, Alek, then you should ding me for that. And you should, because you're not as smart as you think you are or whatever. And I should do the same service for Alek. And people don't often take kindly to that. And then the defensive maneuver, you asked what the defensive maneuver is, well, let's see how can we operate so we don't have to do that to each other. Mm-hmm. And the way we'll do that is we'll develop really powerful statistics that we don't understand, and we'll collude that we don't really, we'll pretend like we understand what we're doing, but we won't really understand them, and we won't admit it, because if I admit it, then you'll admit it, and if you'll admit it, then everybody will admit it. The whole house of cards will fall down, and so we will agree that we'll provide these highly sophisticated dodges, and the defensive maneuver is it really is a way of avoiding coming to Sadie in ignorance.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something like, it's amazing that people are able to communicate at all, given how different our internal worlds are, the way we have to translate that, the metaphors. I think there's really something to be said about that. And I think it's kind of the journalist's art as much as it is the DES interviewer's art to embrace that you have no idea what people are saying.
It is definitely humbling, and it kind of like almost makes you want to give up on the whole endeavor.
Yeah.
Well, so let me push back against that, because I've been doing this endeavor for 50 years or something, a lot of years, pretty close to 50 actually. And it is as interesting to me today as it was then, or more so. I would say my interaction with Sadie in 2021 is as interesting and fresh and vital as any interaction that took place in 1970, whatever, or whatever. And I'm not sure that most scientists can say that. I think if they're honest with each other, they're going through the motions, and the best that the real goal for most scientists is to get their graduate students to do the work so that then they can collect their grant money. And it's not exciting to them, I don't think. Maybe there's a kernel of excitement in there somewhere, but you know, I think people are. I think the heart of the matter is that people are interesting, and everybody who is a psychologist, I think, believes that people are interesting. That is the motivation of psychology, and I have been lucky enough to have figured out a way to keep that center in my professional life. And I don't think it's not that I'm unique. Other people could do it. But it takes some guts and some foresight and some self-effacing humor and some whatever.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I really, really appreciate it. I can't wait to see your breakdown of learned about me. And
I will be interested in seeing what you write about this, because I think you have some things to write about that nobody else, hardly anybody else on the planet has to write. And whether you can bring yourself to write it and find somebody who will take it, I don't know. But
I think so. I have a really good agent now, so that's okay.
Say that again.
Oh, I said I got a really good agent. So that's okay.
Yeah. But I think you said earlier on, I think that you were talking to somebody at the Atlantic or whatever. I think you have articles to write about what happened here that could be totally interesting if you could figure out how to say it.
Yeah, and definitely keep me up to date on your bulimia submissions, or if you get an acceptance. Yeah.
You got it.
Send me a paper if you feel like it. I promise I won't forward it to anyone.
Yeah, we can do that. We haven't submitted a bulimia paper lately because we don't have anybody left to submit it to. But
yeah,
I've written a little bit about it in my books. I guess my 2011 book maybe has a bulimia article.
Oh, cool.
Bulimia chapter.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again, and yeah, let's be in touch. You guys are up.
Alrighty. Nice meeting you and spending time with you.
Yeah, likewise.